You are standing in front of a single, unsettling photograph. A stiff, formal wedding portrait from 1889, mounted on cream card, the studio stamp J.S. Hargrave, Harrowsfield, New York, pressed into the border. The bride sits in a high-backed chair, lace veil spilling over her shoulders, bouquet arranged perfectly in her hands. The groom stands beside her, one gloved hand on the chair, the other held tight at his side. Something is wrong in her face. The bride's eyes don't quite meet the lens. Her mouth is slightly parted but slack, as if whatever word she meant to speak slipped away. At the corner of her lips, there is a faint dark line that doesn't look like shadow. Turn the card over, and in a looping hand, it reads, "Our wedding day, February 12, 1889, Margaret and Edward." In the death register for the town of Harrowsfield, New York, the same name appears, Margaret Pierce, spinster, age 24, listed as having died suddenly on the morning of February 12th before any church bells rang. A surviving coroner's report places her time of death hours before this photograph could have been taken in any studio. So the contradiction sits there in your hands. How can a bride pose for her wedding photograph if, by every official record, she had already been dead for hours? To answer that, we have to leave the cream card and the ink for a moment and follow a trail through church ledgers, inquest files, studio logs, family letters, back to the day a small town in upstate New York tried to celebrate a wedding and bury a bride at the same time. For that, we start with the place itself. In the late 19th century, Harrowsfield was the kind of upstate town you could miss if you blinked from a train window. One Episcopal church, one weekly newspaper, one photography studio on Main Street. Marriage announcements and obituaries shared the same narrow column in the Harrowsfield Gazette. Weddings and funerals often separated only by a few lines of type. On paper, the couple in the photograph are easy to identify. Margaret Pierce was 24, daughter of John Pierce, who ran Pierce's Dry Goods on Main Street. In letters her younger sister wrote later, Margaret appears as a careful girl who sewed her own clothes by lamplight, piecing together her wedding dress so that father need not bear the cost. Edward Latham, the groom, was a clerk at the local bank. In a brief memoir, he is remembered as ambitious, perhaps too eager to rise above his station, the sort of man who always seemed to be counting more than the coins in front of him. The ceremony, everyone agreed, was supposed to happen at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. Its rector, the Reverend Charles Endicott, had penciled them into his register for the afternoon of February 12, 1889. Endicott appears in a diocesan directory as earnest in doctrine, cautious in innovation, a man unlikely to bend rules easily. The town's physician and coroner, Dr. Amos Wilcox, had been in practice for decades, as likely to sign a birth certificate as to perform a small post-mortem. And on Main Street, Josiah S. Hargrave operated the photography studio whose stamp appears on the back of the card. His advertisements in the Gazette promised portraits, wedding groups, and memorial likenesses taken in all weathers.
This case stands apart from ordinary misfortune because of how these names and records collide. In the bound volumes of the Gazette, the issue after February 12th carries, in its social column, a small notice. Married at St. Matthew's Church on the 12th inst., Mr. Edward Latham and Miss Margaret Pierce, both of this village. In the same column, inches below, is a death notice. Died on the 12th inst., very suddenly at her father's residence, Miss Margaret Pierce, aged 24 years. The church's marriage register, preserved on microfilm, shows a faint entry for Latham Pierce, then a thin line of ink striking it through. In the margin, in Latin, someone has written, non consummatum, not accomplished. Out in Harrowsfield Cemetery, on the Pierce family plot, there is a stone-carved Margaret Pierce Latham, beloved daughter and bride. Yet in the county's official death index, she is recorded simply as unmarried. More than a century later, what survives is this tangle. The wedding photograph with its handwritten date, the bound gazette with its contradictory notices, the parish register with its erased line, the cemetery stone calling her a wife, the civil record insisting she died a spinster, and the coroner's inquest file that notes, in a dry hand, that when he examined her body, she was already in full rigor. He adds one unsettling line. I am told, however, that a marriage ceremony was attempted not long before. If she was already cold when he touched her, why does the photograph show her sitting upright in her gown, bouquet in hand, presented to the world as newlywed? The image that raises that question did not come out of the ground with the stone. It came from a box at a country estate sale. In 2019, a hobbyist genealogist named Rachel Manning was picking through a cluttered barn in the Harrowsfield area. The family who owned the property was clearing out generations of belongings. On one table sat a cardboard box full of papers, loose snapshots, and stiff cabinet cards bound with twine. Rachel was used to this. She had found family treasures for strangers more than once. Among the stack, one photograph caught her eye. A young woman in late 1880s bridal fashion, a high-necked white dress, tight bodice, long sleeves, a heavy veil. A man in a dark suit standing beside her. The pose was formal to the point of stiffness. She flipped it over. In brown ink, in a sloping hand, someone had written, "Our wedding day, February 12, 1889, M. Pierce and E. Latham." The cardstock was embossed with J.S. Hargrave, Photograph Rooms, Harrowsfield, NY. At a glance, it was simply an old wedding photo. Rachel bought the bundle for a few dollars, thinking she might trace the couple and offer it to any living descendants. It wasn't until she scanned the image at home, enlarging it on her screen, that something about it began to disturb her. The bride's posture was perfectly upright, but her hands seemed arranged rather than resting. Her fingers curled just so around the bouquet without the small tension you expect when someone holds something. Her head seemed supported in an invisible way, her neck too straight. The groom's expression was no help. He stared forward, jaw tight, eyes set, looking less like a man on his wedding day and more like someone forced to stand beside a coffin. Curiosity, for a genealogist, is a reflex. Rachel went to work. On census databases, she searched for Latham and Pierce in Harrowsfield around 1880 to 1900. She found a Pierce family. John Pierce, dry goods merchant, his wife Ellen, two daughters, Margaret E., aged 24 in 1888, and Clara, younger by a few years. In 1900, though, there was no sign of Margaret Latham. Instead, the census listed Clara Pierce, sister, single, living with her widowed father. Margaret was gone.
To find out why, Rachel turned to the Harrowsfield Gazette, now digitized on a site that collects New York newspapers. She pulled up the issues around February 1889. That's when she saw the paired notices, the small joy of married at St. Matthew's Church and the abrupt sorrow of died very suddenly, both naming Margaret, both dated the 12th. At first, she assumed a simple explanation. Perhaps the wedding had been planned for the 12th, but actually took place earlier, and someone, out of sentiment, wrote the planned date on the back of the photograph. Or perhaps the newspaper, always prone to delayed corrections, hadn't updated its notices quickly enough after a tragedy. But the date on the card was very clear. The civil death register, which the county had also digitized, gave a harder edge to the question. Under Pierce Margaret E., it recorded the date of death as February 12, 1889, at 11:15 a.m. The cause of death
was listed first as sudden collapse, possible apoplexy. In the coroner's summary attached to that entry, in different ink, there was a later note. On further inquiry, symptoms inconsistent with stroke, stomach contents preserved for analysis. And in the margin, subject reportedly carried to photography rooms in the afternoon in bridal attire. In my opinion, already deceased at that time. The photograph in Rachel's hand, labeled as a celebration, might be something else entirely. A record not of a bride about to step into married life, but of a body, carefully dressed in white, and posed to look as if she had lived long enough to say, "I do." To test that, and to understand why anyone would make such a picture, she had to leave the computer screen and walk into the past in a more literal way. The Harrowsfield Historical Society occupies 2 rooms above what used to be the post office. There are glass cases with old tools, shelves of town reports, boxes of clippings. When Rachel asked about the Pierce and Latham families, a volunteer pointed her toward a vertical file drawer. In one folder was a yellowing typescript, a 1930s local history column from the Gazette titled "The Wedding That Never Was." It referred, briefly, to the sad case of Miss Pierce, who died upon her wedding morn, giving rise to much gossip and speculation in our grandmother's day. Further down in the article, the writer mentioned a dispute over the Pierce estate, happily settled in favor of blood, and a photograph that some thought in poor taste, showing the young woman in her bridal dress after she had already gone to her rest. In the county courthouse, in a bundle of papers tied with fraying tape and labeled Wilcox 1888 to 1890, Rachel found the full inquest file on Margaret's death. Dr. Wilcox wrote that he had been summoned to the Pierce home around 9:45 a.m. on February 12th. He found Margaret unconscious on a bed, breathing shallowly, pupils fixed, skin cool to the touch. Despite attempts at stimulation and smelling salts, she did not respond. He pronounced her dead at 11:15 p.m. When he returned at 2 p.m. to conduct a post-mortem, he noted that lividity, the pooling of blood after death, was already present in dependent areas, suggesting that some hours had passed since death. Under witness statements, he added one short but revealing line. Mr. Latham and Mr. Pierce expressed desire that declaration of death be delayed until after certain rites could be performed. I refused. In the parish records of St. Matthew's, the nearly erased line that had puzzled other researchers came into focus. Between 2 tidy entries for couples married earlier in that month, Edward Latham, Margaret Pierce had been written in the same ink and hand. A light stroke of the pen crossed it out. In the margin, the brief Latin phrase, non rite celebratum, not rightly celebrated. Vestry minutes from March 1889, preserved on the same microfilm reel, recorded a discussion in which Reverend Endicott defended himself against townspeople who whispered that he had married a dead woman. He is quoted as saying, "No sacrament may be given to the departed. Prayers I read, but no vows."
A private letter from Endicott to his bishop, held in the diocesan archives in Albany, fills out the picture. He writes that he was called to the Pierce home, where the young woman lay in her bridal dress. The family begged him to join her to Mr. Latham as husband, for her sake and for the sake of certain arrangements made by her father. He refused, but agreed to commend her soul to God and comfort the living. He underlined one sentence, "I did not and could not solemnize a marriage over a corpse." The last piece of institutional evidence came from Hargrave's own hand. When his studio finally closed in the early 20th century, his daybooks, simple ledger volumes, ended up in the Historical Society's storage. On the page for February 12, 1889, one entry stands out.
Pierce Latham wedding portrait, 3 cabs. Next to it, in a pencil that looks as though it was added later, someone has written, difficult sitting, subject unable to hold pose, head brace used. A photography historian whom Rachel consulted explained that heavy head braces and posing stands were common in 19th century studios. Long exposure times required subjects to hold still. But the phrase, unable to hold pose, especially in a wedding context, was unusual. It suggested not a fidgety bride, but someone who could not participate in the work at all. In a Pierce family album, donated to the Society decades earlier, there was one more image from Hargrave's studio. Here, the same woman lay on a chaise, veiled, hands folded, bouquet on her chest, eyes closed. The card mount bore the same imprint. On the album page, in a much older hand, Clara Pierce had written, Maggie, taken as we laid her out, February 1889. That confirmed what the 1930s columnist had hinted at. The family had commissioned at least one post-mortem photograph. The question was whether the seated, wedding day portrait was effectively another one. Under magnification, high-resolution scans of the wedding portrait showed details the naked eye might miss. The bride's pupils were widely dilated, unfocused. There was no visible tension in the corners of her mouth. Just behind her head, almost lost in the background, was the faint outline of a vertical metal rod, likely the top of a posing stand. None of that by itself proves she was dead. People faint, people are sedated, but paired with Dr. Wilcox's timing, Hargrave's notation, and Endicott's insistence that she was beyond awareness when he arrived, the likelihood that she was alive in that chair grows small. The emotional tone of the story, though, starts to emerge most clearly in the letters Margaret's sister Clara wrote to an aunt in Albany after the funeral. In one, dated March 1889, Clara says, "Father would not have her spoken of as only a corpse. He said she was a bride in God's sight, though she never came to church. Edward, too, clings to calling her my wife. They had the picture made so the world would see her as she should have been." In another letter, she writes more bluntly, "There is much talk of the farm and to whom it shall fall, whether to Edward as husband as father intended, or back to us as her kin. I do not pretend to know the law, only that grief has many hands in this house, and some reach towards the land more than toward her memory." Taken together, these scraps of evidence start to point in the same direction, not towards a supernatural wedding, but towards a deliberate act. Dressing a dead woman in her gown, carrying her to the studio, and composing an image that could serve as proof, for memory, for conscience, perhaps also for the courts, that the wedding, in some sense, had taken place. To see just how far that idea was pushed, you have to read one more set of papers in the courthouse basement. In the civil docket for 1890, there is a case titled Latham v. Pierce et al. The plaintiff is Edward Latham. The defendants are Clara Pierce and other relatives of John Pierce, who had died less than a year after his daughter. The subject is the estate. John Pierce's will, entered into the record, states that his farm and shop are to pass to my daughter Margaret and her lawful husband, should such exist at the time of my passing, otherwise to my surviving issue. It is a clause meant perhaps to protect Margaret from being left alone, while also keeping the property in the bloodline if she remains unmarried.
Edward sues, claiming to be that lawful husband. He produces the wedding photograph and the Gazette notice as evidence. Witnesses testify that John Pierce had stood before friends and spoken of my daughter's upcoming marriage into the Latham family, and had hinted that Edward would one day take over the shop. Clara and the other Pierce relatives contest the claim. Their lawyer points to the death certificate, which lists spinster, and to the struck-through church register.
He calls Reverend Endicott and Dr. Wilcox to the stand. Under questioning, Edward concedes that Margaret never reached St. Matthew's. He describes her collapse at home, in her gown, before the carriage came. He tells the court that as she lay unconscious, he knelt beside the bed and whispered vows in her ear, that her father joined our hands and gave his blessing. He insists that, in God's eyes, they were wed, whether or not the rector spoke the formal words. Hargrave's sworn statement stands in stark contrast. He tells the court that Margaret was in no sense living when she was brought in. He describes how two men, John Pierce and Edward, carried her between them, how he and an assistant set her in the chair, arranged her dress and veil, and used a head brace to keep her upright. He admits retouching her cheeks to restore a more lifelike color at their request. They spoke, he says, of needing a proper wedding portrait to show others. With that testimony, the nature of the photograph becomes painfully clear. The image Rachel found in a dusty box and read as a wedding memento is, by its creator's words, a post-mortem portrait arranged to look like a living wedding portrait. When we first stood in front of it, the mystery seemed to be, how could a living bride outlast her own death record? Now the question has shifted. What exactly were the living trying to accomplish by presenting her this way? There are at least two ways to answer that. The kindest reading is that John Pierce and Edward were shattered by the sudden loss. Everything had been prepared, the dress, the church, the notices. To have Margaret spoken of only as a corpse, to have her last image be that of someone laid out for burial, may have felt unbearable. Dressing her in her gown and photographing her beside the man she was meant to marry could have been, in their minds, a way of honoring what should have been. In Clara's words, they wanted the world to see her as she should have been. The darker reading pays attention to the will. Both men knew that John had tied the estate to Margaret's marital status. By insisting on calling her Mrs. Latham, by sending a marriage notice to the Gazette, by placing a wedding photograph into circulation and perhaps into the judge's hands, Edward seems to have been building a case that, whatever the fine points of church law, he should be treated as her husband for purposes of inheritance. Grief and money run together in the record, and it is difficult to pull them apart cleanly. Some questions never fully resolve. The coroner's early suspicion that Margaret's symptoms did not match a simple stroke led him to preserve her stomach contents for analysis. No lab report survives. Later family stories, recorded decades on, whisper that Margaret had second thoughts and may have taken laudanum on her own. Others hint that someone anxious about the match may have dosed her tea. There is no proof of murder, only a young woman's abrupt death, an inconvenient clause in a will, and a series of acts afterward that blur love, denial, and self-interest. The most likely sequence of events, though, comes into view when all the documents are laid side by side. In late 1888, Margaret and Edward announced their engagement. John Pierce, wanting to ensure his daughter's security, writes or updates his will, leaving the farm and shop to her and any lawful husband she may have when he dies, with the fallback that if she remains single, the estate returns to his other children. The wedding is set for February 12, 1889. Margaret finishes her dress by candlelight. Notices are drafted. Hargrave's studio is likely notified that a wedding portrait will be wanted that morning, a common practice for families who can afford it. On the morning itself, before the carriages arrive, Margaret collapses at home. Whether from a hemorrhage, a hidden heart defect, a toxic dose of laudanum, or something more sinister, we do not know. Dr. Wilcox is called. By his notes, she is unresponsive and beyond help before noon.
In the aftermath, in a house already draped in white for celebration, plans collide. Family and fiancé are in shock. They beg Reverend Endicott to marry them anyway, perhaps over the bed. He refuses, but comes, prays, and tries to comfort them. Somewhere in this moment, John and Edward begin to talk of how Margaret will be remembered and what will become of the property. The newspaper's marriage notice goes to press, likely based on information sent days earlier or at Edward's urgent request. The editor, faced with the cruel coincidence that the bride's death must be announced at the same time, chooses not to pull the marriage line, perhaps out of a sense of kindness, perhaps out of haste. Someone at St. Matthew's, anticipating the ceremony, has already written Latham Pierce in the register. Later, at Endicott's direction, the clerk draws a line through it and adds, non rete celebratum. There will be no official certificate. In the hours after Margaret's death, John and Edward arrange with Hargrave to bring her to the studio. They dress her again in the gown, fix her veil, carry her down the street. In the photographer's rooms, she is placed in the chair, supported by a stand. Edward stands beside her. The shutter clicks. Then, perhaps later that day or the next, another image is made of her lying out on a chaise, hands folded, bouquet on her chest. On the back of the seated portrait, someone, most likely Edward, writes, "Our wedding day." It is a declaration, a plea, and an argument all at once. When John dies less than a year later, the meaning of that argument becomes concrete. Edward sues, armed with the photograph and the Gazette notice, insisting that, in spirit if not in form, he was Margaret's husband, and thus entitled to share in Pierce's estate. In Latham versus Pierce, the court listens to Wilcox, Endicott, Hargrave, and the family. It weighs the will's language against church law. In the end, the judge sides with Clara and the other blood relatives. The opinion notes that no photograph can constitute a marriage, nor can the wishes of survivors rewrite the facts of a death. The estate reverts to Margaret's kin. The photograph remains what it always was, a powerful image, but not a legal act. The emotional weight of all this settles, finally, on one choice. The choice to carry Margaret's body to Hargrave's studio, to paint a little color back into her face, to press a pen to the back of the card and call that moment our wedding day, when, by every clock in town, her time had already stopped. That decision was made, almost certainly, in grief. It also served other ends. It allowed those left behind to tell themselves and others that the day had not been entirely stolen, that some version of what was planned had come to pass. It blurred, intentionally or not, the line between what happened and what was supposed to happen. When you look at the photograph now, knowing this, every small detail changes. The bride's slack fingers on the bouquet, the heavy fall of the dress, the groom's expression, not nervous, not joyful, but strained. No longer is it a riddle about a woman outliving her own death certificate. It is a document of the living staging a wedding around someone who could no longer say yes or no. After the court case, the story slowly receded. In the 1900 census, Edward appears not in Harrowsfield, but in Rochester, another small name on a busy page. Bank clerk, single. There is no mention of a wife, no children linked to him in later records. Clara Pierce, in contrast, marries a local farmer, keeps Pierce as her middle name, and stays in Harrowsfield until her death in the 1940s. Family stories recorded by a grandniece in the 1970s refer, in half-whispers, to Aunt Margaret, the bride who never was, and the trouble over the farm. In some local histories, Margaret's case is mentioned only briefly, turned into a cautionary tale about weak nerves and the dangers of too much excitement. The legal fight disappears from the narrative. The photograph likely stayed in a box with other family papers, the inscription on its back the only clear assertion of that wedding day. When Rachel scanned the image and shared it on a genealogy forum, reactions split along familiar lines. Some people, attuned to the signs of Victorian post-mortem photography, declared, "She's definitely dead." Others insisted it was simply the era's stiffness, that people didn't smile back then. One small regional museum working on an exhibit about 19th century mourning and marriage asked to borrow the photograph. They printed the caption, "The wedding that never was." There is, understandably, unease in turning such an intimate tragedy into something strangers look at under glass. But the records were always public. Death registers, court cases, church minutes. The photograph itself was made to be seen, to travel beyond the parlor table. The line between documenting the past and exploiting it is thin, especially when the central figure is a woman who left no words of her own, but the image others constructed around her. St. Matthew's still stands on its little rise in Harrowsfield, its wooden pews refinished, its bell tower repaired. Couples still stand on its steps for portraits on bright Saturdays, veils and rented tuxedos, and phones held up to catch the moment. A few blocks away, the building that once housed Hargrave's studio now holds an antiques shop. In the dimness of its back room, boxes of old photographs sit on shelves. Faces stare out from card mounts, names fading on their backs, each one a tiny argument about how someone wanted to be remembered. Cases like Margaret's show how deeply people rely on photographs to fix not just a moment, but a story. In the late 19th century, families used the camera to hold loved ones in the roles they were meant to play. The infant in white, the father at his desk, the bride in her gown, even when illness or accident cut those roles short. Deathbed portraits of children dressed in Sunday best, propped as if asleep, were common. What makes this wedding photograph so quietly disturbing is that it tries to serve two masters at once. It is a memorial image, and at the same time it was pressed into service as evidence of a marriage that never fully existed. We have not stopped doing versions of this. We share carefully staged pictures of hospital beds, of anniversaries that someone didn't live to see, of empty chairs with a bouquet laid across them, telling ourselves and others, this is how it was meant to be. The image becomes less about what happened and more about what should have. The camera in Harrowsfield did not lie exactly. It showed a man and a woman in wedding clothes on the date written in ink. The falsehood lived in everything left outside the frame. The coroner's clock, the struck-through entry in a church register, the cold weight of a body in lace carried across a studio floor. Sometimes, the most unsettling photographs are not the ones that show death openly, but the ones that show, in their careful staging, just how far the living will go to pretend it hasn't already arrived.